The moment Kate Keene walked into the Millhaven church hall on that crisp October evening in 1882, she understood with perfect clarity that she had made a grave mistake in coming at all. The autumn social had been her sister's idea, not hers. Clara had pressed the invitation into Kate's hands 3 days prior, waving it like a small flag of victory over the grief that had settled into the Keene household like dust after a long, dry summer. Their father had passed in July, leaving Kate and Clara to manage the boarding house on their own, and Clara had decided, with all the determination of a woman who had never once in her life accepted sorrow as a permanent state, that Kate needed fresh air and society, and something other than ledger books and laundry soap to occupy her mind. So here she was, standing just inside the doorway of the Millhaven church hall, wearing her best dress of deep burgundy wool, her dark hair pinned up with the tortoiseshell combs her mother had left her, watching the gathered ranchers and farmers and townspeople of Millhaven, Texas, mill about beneath paper lanterns that someone had strung from the ceiling rafters with great optimism and moderate skill. The year 1882 had been a hard one for the whole county. Drought in early summer, then an outbreak of screwworm that had taken cattle from half the ranches east of the Brazos, and the people moving around the long trestle tables were carrying that particular brand of tiredness that came not from one bad day, but from 6 months of consecutive ones. Kate recognized most of the faces. Old Hector Purvis from the Mercantile, who had extended credit to the Keene boarding house without being asked when her father fell ill. Reverend Moss and his wife, Martha, who always stood very close together as though they feared separation might be permanent. The Garfield sisters, twins of about 40, who ran the millinery and who could reduce any piece of social news to its lowest possible denomination with startling efficiency. Deputy Roland Cruz, who was neither particularly good at his job nor particularly bad, which in Millhaven passed for adequate. And ranchers, a dozen of them, easy men who smelled of horses and leather and the outdoors, their Sunday shirts pressed by wives or housekeepers but their hands irreparably shaped by hard work, calloused and wide. Clara materialized at Kate's elbow with the speed of someone who had been watching the door. "You came," Clara said, as though she had entertained genuine doubts. "I said I would," Kate replied. "You have said many things and not done them since July." Clara linked her arm through Kate's and steered her toward the refreshment table before Kate could form a suitable response to that. "Come and eat something. Mrs. Haverson brought her spice cake and you have not eaten spice cake since last Christmas." The refreshment table was set along the far wall, draped in white muslin, and bore the contributions of approximately half the women of Millhaven: corn bread and dried apple pie, and a large ceramic pot of coffee that was being watched over by old Amos Teague's wife, Dorothea, who guarded it with the territorial intensity of a woman who had learned from experience that men at socials would drain a coffee pot in under 10 minutes if left unsupervised. Kate allowed Clara to press a plate of spice cake into her hands, and she stood at the edge of the table eating it in small bites, and watching the room with the particular detachment of someone who feels simultaneously present and very far away. She had been doing that a great deal since July. Her father, William Keene, had been a broad-shouldered, laughing man who had built the boarding house with his own hands in 1868, and who had believed absolutely that Millhaven, Texas, was destined for greatness. His death at 61 from a sudden fever had not been expected, and Kate, who at 26 had been her father's constant companion, and the one he taught to keep the accounts and fix the roof and decide when the well needed new rope, had not yet found a way to properly reorganize the world around his absence. She was thinking about this, about the particular shape of the empty chair at the head of the dining table, when the man came to stand beside her at the refreshment table. She noticed him first as a physical presence, tall, broader in the shoulder than most men in the room, wearing a dark jacket that had seen good use and a white shirt that was cleaner than most. His hat was off, which was more than could be said for 3 of the ranchers on the other side of the room, and his hair was a dark brown that caught the lamplight when he moved his head. He reached past her for a plate, and she moved slightly to give him room, and he said, "Excuse me, ma'am," with the automatic courtesy of a man whose manners were not performed but habitual. "Of course," she said. He filled his plate with corn bread and a slice of pie, and she thought that would be the entirety of their exchange, which was fine. She was not there to exchange anything with anyone. She was there because Clara had asked her to come, and because refusing every good thing people offered you eventually became its own kind of prison. But then Dorothea Teague, who had been monitoring the coffee pot with such vigilance, was pulled away by her husband, who required her immediate assistance with some matter at the other end of the hall involving a knocked-over chair and a great deal of apology. And in Dorothea's absence, the coffee pot sat unguarded on the table, and 3 ranchers who had been circling it like vultures immediately descended. Kate watched this with mild amusement. She set down her cake plate and reached for a cup, and in the small scramble of men reaching and pouring and elbowing, she was simply outmaneuvered, which she would have accepted without comment because it was a trivial thing, and she was not the kind of woman who made scenes over coffee. But before she had even completed the thought, the tall man beside her picked up the pot, and he did not pour his own coffee first. He turned to her, entirely without ceremony, without the elaborate gallantry of a man performing chivalry for an audience, and he filled her cup first. He did it the way he had said "excuse me," as though it were simply the obvious, natural, correct thing to do, and there was nothing remarkable about it at all. She looked up at him. He looked back at her, and his eyes were a gray-green color that she found difficult to categorize, and there was a small seriousness at the corners of his mouth that was not unfriendly. "Thank you," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and filled his own cup. 3 of the other ranchers nearby had not even registered the exchange. Kate had. She would not stop registering it for a very long time. She did not speak to him again that evening. She moved through the social with Clara, ate 2 pieces of spice cake when Clara wasn't watching, listened to Reverend Moss give a brief and mercifully practical speech about community and shared hardship, watched 2 of the Garfield sisters' cousins attempt to waltz to the fiddle music and nearly take out a trestle table. She laughed for the first time since July at something Clara said about the dancing, and Clara beamed at her with such unconcealed relief that Kate felt a wave of gratitude and guilt in equal measure. But she kept track of him, the tall man with the gray-green eyes, without meaning to. She did not know his name. She watched him speak with 2 other ranchers near the door, serious, measured conversation, the kind men had about land and water and the price of cattle. She watched him help an older woman carry a dish to the table without being asked. She watched him, at the end of the evening, hold the door open for a group of people leaving, and then slip out himself without fanfare or ceremony. She did not ask Clara his name that night. She stored the curiosity away like a letter you meant to answer later, and she went home and lay in the dark of her father's old house and thought about the coffee cup, and the way he had simply done it, and she slept better than she had in 3 months. She learned his name 4 days later. It was Hector Purvis who told her, in the way that Hector Purvis dispensed most useful information, indirectly, in the course of a conversation about something else entirely. Kate had come to the mercantile for lamp oil and flour, and Hector was behind the counter reading a week-old newspaper and commenting on it to no one in particular, which was his characteristic mode. "Bishop's taken on 2 more hands," Hector said, folding the newspaper to a different crease. "Man works hard, I will say that for him. 3 years ago that ranch was half dead, and now he's running 400 head. Kate set her basket on the counter. "Which Bishop is that?" "Daniel Bishop. His daddy owned the Rocking Bee out east of town past the Jensen spread. His daddy died, must be 4 years ago now, and the ranch was in a bad way. Daniel came back from up north somewhere, Kansas I think, took it over. People thought he'd sell it off. Hector shook his head with the appreciative air of a man who respected stubbornness as a virtue. Didn't sell it, built it back up. Quiet type. Comes in regular, pays his accounts, never makes trouble. Kate paid for her flour and lamp oil. Tall man, dark hair. Hector looked at her over his spectacles with the mild professional interest of a man who noticed everything. That be him. Why, you know him. No, Kate said. I think I saw him at the social is all. She walked home with the flour and the lamp oil and the name, and she put the name with the image she already held, the coffee pot, the easy courtesy, the gray-green eyes, and she told herself it did not signify anything particular. She was aware, with the dry honesty that she generally applied to her own feelings, that she was lying to herself. November came in cold and fast, the way it often did in central Texas, with a north wind that found every gap in every wall and a frost that killed off the last of the garden. The boarding house had 3 tenants at the moment. A traveling seed merchant named Cooper, who had been in Millhaven 3 weeks and showed no sign of leaving. A young schoolteacher named Miss Ella Voss, who had come to fill the position left vacant when the previous teacher had married and moved to Abilene, and an older gentleman named Mr. Farris, who was retired from something he never specified, and who spent his days reading and his evenings playing solitaire at the parlor table. Kate managed them all with the competence she had been trained to by her father, meals at set hours, clean linens, firm but courteous house rules posted in each room. She was good at it. She had always been good at practical things. It was only the other category of things, the softer and less defined ones, at which she had less experience. She was 26 years old. She had been engaged once, briefly, to a man named Thomas Archer who had been a junior partner at the bank, and the engagement had dissolved after 8 months by mutual and largely unspoken agreement, the way arrangements sometimes do when they are built on the idea of what a thing should be rather than what it actually is. She did not mourn Thomas Archer. She was not certain she had ever been in love with him, which had been part of the problem. Her mother had died when Kate was 15, and her father had told her, in the frank way he discussed everything, that love between a man and a woman was not a comfortable thing, not a gentle rolling landscape, but something with real weather in it, storms and clear days in equal measure, and you wanted to be standing next to someone who knew how to weather both. She had not found that person in Thomas Archer. She had been, since then, making her peace with the boarding house and the ledger books, and the certainty that she was, in all practical ways, fine. It was Miss Ella Voss who brought Daniel Bishop into the boarding house dining room. Ella Voss was 23, with red hair and a very direct manner of speaking that Kate admired, and the seed merchant Cooper seemed to find alarming. She was also, it turned out, the younger sister of one of Daniel Bishop's ranch hands, a young man named Pete Voss who had come to work the rocking bee that spring. "My brother speaks very well of Mr. Bishop," Ella told Kate one morning at breakfast, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup against the cold. "Says he's a fair man to work for. Pays on time, doesn't ask more than is reasonable, teaches the younger hands what they need to know." "That's a recommendation," Kate said, refilling the bread basket. "He's coming to dinner Sunday," Ella said, with the carefully studied nonchalance of someone delivering news they know is news. Pete asked if he might, since Mr. Bishop has no family nearby and Pete didn't want him spending Sunday alone. "I hope that's all right." "The dining room seats 12, Kate said. "We're at 5 with your brother. It's more than all right." She said this in a perfectly level voice, and then went to the kitchen and stood at the stove for a moment longer than the stove required her to. Sunday came with pale yellow sunlight and the smell of pine resin on the wind. Kate made a roast, a proper one, with root vegetables and a pan gravy that her father had always said was her best accomplishment, and 2 pies, 1 apple and 1 dried peach, and corn bread because there was always corn bread. The dining room smelled warm and good, and the boarders gathered with the particular gladness that people feel when the table is full and the food is real. Pete Voss arrived at noon with his employer, and Kate, who had been in the kitchen when they came in, heard their boots on the hall floorboards and wiped her hands on her apron and walked through to meet them. Daniel Bishop was exactly as she remembered from the social: tall, broad-shouldered, the dark jacket, the easy way he held himself that was neither arrogant nor uncertain, but simply settled. He turned when she came through the kitchen door, and his gray-green eyes found her immediately. And for a fraction of a second, something moved across his expression that she could not entirely read, but that made her chest tighten in an entirely involuntary way. "Mr. Bishop," she said, extending her hand with the steady practicality of a woman who ran a household, "Kate Keene. Welcome." He took her hand and shook it in the way men shook hands with women they respected, firmly, not tentatively, not the limp courtesy that implied fragility. "Thank you for having me, Miss Keene. I appreciate it." His voice was lower than she had expected from the social, where she had only heard him speak briefly. It had a quality of deliberateness to it, as though he said what he meant and had given prior thought to what he meant. "My father built this house," she said, "because it seemed important to establish that. Clara and I run it now. You'll find the table well set, I hope." "I can already smell that it is," he said, and there was the small seriousness at the corners of his mouth that she had noticed before, which she now understood was not solemnity, but the precursor to a different kind of smile, restrained, genuine, the kind that didn't come out for strangers. Dinner was long and good and full of conversation. Pete Voss was young and talkative and devoted to his sister, and his presence gave the table a warmth it sometimes lacked. Cooper the seed merchant talked about the spring planting prospects at length. Mr. Ferris listened and made occasional dry observations. Clara, who had arrived at noon as she did every Sunday, sat across from Daniel Bishop and spoke to him with the direct friendliness that was her natural mode, and Kate watched, over the course of the meal, as he answered her questions with a patience and honesty that she found remarkable in a man who was, in all outward evidence, deeply private. He had come back to Texas from Wichita, he said, when his father died. The ranch had been mortgaged, the cattle count low, 2 of the hands gone. He had worked 4 years to rebuild it, and it was now where he wanted it to be, not large by the standards of the great ranches, but solid, well-run, capable of supporting a real future. "A man should have something to show for his work," Clara said approvingly. "Or a woman," Kate said, without looking up from her plate. There was a small silence, and then Daniel Bishop said, "That's right," in a tone that meant he agreed completely and found the amendment obvious rather than remarkable, and Kate looked up then, and he was looking at her with a directness that was not rude but was very clear, and she held his gaze for a moment and then looked at her pie. After dinner, while Clara helped Ella clear the table, a domestic ritual Clara had appointed herself to weeks ago, Kate stood on the back porch with a cup of coffee, watching the late afternoon light go thin and golden over the yard. She heard the door open behind her and did not turn, but she knew from the weight of the footstep that it was him. "I hope I'm not intruding," Daniel Bishop said. "You are not," she said. He came to stand beside her at the porch rail, not too close, at a distance that was respectful without being distant, and she was aware of him with a precision that made the cold air feel sharp and specific. "Your sister tells me you've been running this place largely on your own since your father passed," he said, not as a question, not as pity, simply as a fact he had been given and was acknowledging. "Clara helps on weekends," Kate said. "The boarders are not difficult, I manage." "I don't doubt it," he said. She looked at him sideways. "That isn't a condescending thing to say, is it?" "No," he said, and the small precursor to the real smile appeared. "It's an observation. You run a clean house. You cook better than anyone I've sat down to a meal with in 4 years, and you corrected your sister's oversight at dinner without raising your voice. You manage very well." She felt the warmth of it move through her despite herself. "You were at the Millhaven social in October," she said. He turned to look at her more fully. "I was. You poured my coffee," she said, "before your own." He was quiet for a moment, and she had the impression he was searching his memory not because he had forgotten, but because he was locating it precisely. "I remember," he said. "The other men didn't bother," she said. "The other men weren't paying attention," he said simply. The air between them felt changed in a way that she could not have quantified, but that was undeniable. The light was going copper and low, and the wind moved through the dried grass at the edge of the yard, and she thought of what her father had said about love with real weather in it, and she felt, for the first time in months, that she was standing in a place where weather was possible. "You should come for Sunday dinner again," she said. "If Pete is coming." "I'd like that," he said. He left before dark, riding east on a dark bay horse that moved well, and Kate stood on the porch and watched the road for a moment after he was gone, and then went inside and washed the dishes and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, which was the clean, frightening, particular aliveness of wanting something. He came back the next Sunday, and the one after that. By December, it was simply understood by everyone at the boarding house table, by Clara, by Ella Voss, by Pete, by Cooper the seed merchant, and even by the reclusive Mr. Ferris, that Daniel Bishop's Sunday appearances were the anchor point of the week. He brought things sometimes: a haunch of venison after a good hunting day, a jar of honey from a neighbor's bees, once a carefully wrapped cutting from an unusual plant he had found growing along the creek that he thought Miss Keene might want for the window box, because he had noticed, on his first visit, that she had a window box that wanted attention. She had planted the cutting and it had taken, and she kept it in the kitchen window where the winter sun hit it in the mornings, and she watered it with a regularity that had nothing to do with the plant. They talked. That was the thing that surprised her most, or rather, the thing that surprised her about herself, that she could talk with him so easily. She was not a shy woman, but she was a careful one. She had learned early that much of what people said in social situations was performance rather than communication, and she had little patience for performance. Daniel Bishop did not perform. He spoke directly, and when he didn't know something he said so, and when he had an opinion he stated it without apology but also without the need to dominate, and he listened with the kind of full attention that was increasingly rare and that she found, if she was honest, nearly as attractive as anything else about him. They talked about the ranch and the boarding house and what it meant to run something your parent had built. They talked about the drought and what the next year's grass might look like and what it would mean for cattle prices. They talked about the town itself, the church and the school and the small particular world of Millhaven, Texas, in 1882, which was not the world of the big cattle drives or the legendary frontier, but was a real, working, complicated place with its own social layers and its own injustices and its own stubborn, daily beauty. He told her about the ranch hands, 3 permanent ones, now 2 additional seasonal ones, and how he thought about his responsibilities to them as men, not just as labor. She told him about her father's philosophy of the boarding house, that a person who was traveling deserved not just a bed but a table at which they felt welcomed, and that her father had refused rooms to 2 men, in all his years of keeping the house, on grounds of behavior rather than ability to pay. "Who were they?" Daniel asked. "One was a man who struck his horse in the yard when he thought no one was watching," Kate said. "My father saw it from the window. He came out and returned the man's advance and told him there was no room." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "And the second? A man who spoke to me with disrespect when I was 17 and my father was in town. My father came home and I told him. He went and found the man at the saloon and told him he was no longer welcome." She paused. "The man was twice my father's size." Daniel looked at her. "Your father sounds like he was someone worth knowing." "He was," she said, and her throat tightened briefly, the way it still did when she spoke of him without warning, and she looked at her hands on the table. "He was exactly the kind of man I've spent a great deal of time trying to find worth in the world since losing." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that exists between two people who are in the same place at the same time with the same quality of attention, and Daniel Bishop let it sit without trying to fill it, which was itself a kind of answer. He asked her, in January, if she would like to ride out and see the ranch. He asked her directly, not through Pete or Clara, not through any social intermediary. He came to the boarding house on a Tuesday, a weekday, not a Sunday, which was itself a departure that made Clara raise her eyebrows at Kate across the kitchen. And he stood at the front door with his hat in his hands and asked if she might have an afternoon free sometime that week, and whether she would be interested in seeing the rocking bee. People might talk, she said, not because she feared it but because she thought he should know she was aware of it. People in Millhaven talk about everything, he said. I thought you might come and see what I've built because I think it would interest you and because I would like to show you, if you're willing. She was willing. She went on Thursday, with Clara's enthusiastic blessing and Mr. Ferris's characteristically expressionless nod of acknowledgement, which she had come to understand was his form of approval. Daniel came for her in a wagon, practical, clean, the same dark bay hitched to it alongside a second horse, and they drove east out of Millhaven as the morning warmed up, and the sky went the clear, deep blue of a Texas winter day. The rocking bee sat in a wide, level stretch of land between two low creek-fed ridges, and it was, she saw immediately, exactly what he had described. Not grand, not finished in the way of some of the older ranches with their fine houses and wide galleries, but solid and well-made and clearly tended with care. The main house was a single story with good thick walls and a front porch that faced south to catch the winter sun. The barn and outbuildings were tight and sound. The corrals were well built. The horses in them were good-looking animals, well-muscled and clear-eyed. He showed her everything. Not with the performance of a man showing off his possessions, but with the genuine, practical pride of a person who has worked very hard for something and believes it is worth showing. He introduced her to the hands, older Jed Marsh, who had been with the rocking bee since Daniel's father's time, and who regarded Kate with the squinting appraisal of a man who knew his employer well enough to know that bringing a woman to the ranch was not a casual thing. Young Rafe Torres, who was probably 19 and smiled too easily, and Pete Voss, who greeted Kate with the broad delight of someone who knew more about the situation than anyone had officially told him. She stood at the fence of the main corral and watched the horses and felt the winter sun on her face and thought that this was a place where a person could make something real. The land had that quality, not the dramatic grandeur of the paintings she had seen of the far western mountains, but the honest, workable beauty of land that would give back what you put into it. "What do you think?" Daniel asked, coming to stand beside her. "I think it's good," she said. "I think you have built something worth building." He looked at the corrals and the house and the barn the way a man looks at something he made with his own hands. "I think so too," he said quietly. They ate lunch on the south porch, bread and cold meat and coffee that he had prepared with the same straightforward competence he brought to everything, and they talked for 2 hours in the winter sun about things that seemed to open and expand the more they talked, about what a future in this part of Texas might look like, about what the land needed and what the people needed, and what made a community worth being part of. She felt, sitting there, that she was in the presence of a man who had thought carefully about his life and had some settled convictions about what it ought to contain, and that those convictions, in all their broad strokes, aligned remarkably well with her own. She was not a woman who pretended to herself. She knew what was happening. She had known it since the moment on the back porch in November when he had said, "You manage very well," and she had felt the warmth of it in a way that had nothing to do with approval and everything to do with being seen. She was falling in love with Daniel Bishop, and the process was not dramatic or sudden but steady and accumulative, each detail adding to the next the way water adds to a river. The coffee cup, the window box cutting, the full attention he gave to everything she said, the Tuesday afternoon visit with his hat in his hands, the south porch and the winter sun, and the way he spoke about his land as though it were something he cared for rather than something he owned. What she did not know, on that January afternoon, was whether he was falling in the same direction. She learned it in February, which in retrospect seemed appropriate, not because of the calendar, which she considered a somewhat excessive reason for sentiment, but because February in Central Texas was the month when the land was most clearly in between things, the cold not yet done but the warmth already possible, and everything held a quality of waiting that matched precisely what she felt. He came to the boarding house on a Saturday evening, not a Sunday, which was unusual. Clara was there, as she sometimes was on weekends, and she let him in and brought Kate from the kitchen with an expression that said everything and nothing. He had brought wildflowers, dried ones from the creek bottom, tied with a piece of twine, the kind of thing that was not elaborate but was not careless. He handed them to her at the parlor door, and he said, without preamble, "I have been trying to find the right way to say something to you for several months, and I have concluded there is no right way. There's only saying it." Clara made a small sound from somewhere behind Kate and then disappeared in a way that was not entirely convincing as subtlety, but that Kate was grateful for. "Then say it," Kate said. "I would like to court you," Daniel Bishop said, "properly. With your knowledge and your consent, and in whatever way you think is appropriate for your circumstances and your position. I'm not a man who is good at the decorative parts of things. I don't have speeches prepared. I have a ranch that I'm proud of and a fair amount of work ahead of me and a very clear idea of the kind of woman I would want to build something with, and you are that woman, Kate, if that's something you might want." She held the dried wildflowers and looked at him, and she thought of October in the church hall and the coffee cup and the ordinary completeness of the gesture, and she thought of her father on the front porch in summer evenings saying that love was something with real weather in it, and she said, "I think you should ask Clara if she has any objection, since she is acting as my family at present, and then yes, I would like that very much." He asked Clara, who said, with characteristic directness, that she had no objection whatsoever and that it was about time, which made Kate press her lips together to conceal a smile and made Daniel Bishop's precursor expression shift, briefly and completely, into the full version of the smile she had been waiting to see since October. It was worth waiting for. Courtship in Millhaven, Texas, in 1882 was a thing conducted largely in public, which suited Kate's practical temperament, and which Daniel Bishop navigated with the same undemonstrative competence he brought to everything else. He came on Sundays as before, but now there were also afternoon drives and walks along the town's main street, and twice, attendance at church together, which the Garfield sisters analyzed between themselves with the exhaustive thoroughness of cartographers mapping new territory. He brought her things, not expensive things because he was not a show-off, but useful and thoughtful things. A new ledger book when he noticed hers was nearly full, a small bottle of lavender oil because she had mentioned once, in passing, that she used it for headaches. He asked her opinion on practical matters, the price of feed, whether the boarding house needed a new wood stove, what she thought of the county commissioner's proposal to improve the Eastern Road, and he listened to what she said and incorporated it into his thinking, which she found more affecting than any amount of flowers. She, in turn, was honest with him in a way she had not been with anyone since her father. She told him about the boarding house's finances, which were secure but not comfortable, and about the mortgage her father had taken that still had 4 years on it, and about her quiet fear, in the long nights after her father died, that she would not be equal to what was required. She told him about Thomas Archer and the engagement that had dissolved, without drama or self-pity, as a simple fact of her history. She told him that she was not an easy woman in the sense of being accommodating for its own sake, that she had opinions and standards, and a particular way she believed things ought to be done, and that she was aware this could be difficult. "I know," he said. "That's part of what I'm courting." She took his hand then for the first time as they walked along the creek path south of town, and he curled his fingers around hers in the unhurried way of a man who had wanted to do that for a long time and was not going to rush the moment now that it had arrived. March came, and with it the first real warmth and the sound of water in the creek and the smell of new grass, and the rocking bee was, according to Pete Voss, entering what promised to be a very good spring. The screwworm had not returned. The calving had gone well. Two of the new hands Daniel had taken on in late winter were working out, and old Jed Marsh was teaching them with the patient severity of a man who had forgotten more about cattle than most men ever learned. Kate rode out to the ranch again, this time with Clara in a show of propriety that satisfied the town's expectations, while also satisfying Clara's considerable personal curiosity about everything. And they spent an afternoon that was as easy and warm as the spring air itself. Clara and Pete talking with the gregarious comfort of two people who had been adjacent to the same situation for months. Daniel and Kate walking the creek fence line in the long, golden light of late afternoon. "The grass is coming up good," she said. "Better than last year," he said. "The creek didn't run dry this year like it did in August. That makes all the difference." She looked at the land stretching out on both sides of the creek, green now with new growth, the sky very large and very clear above it. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About the boarding house," she said. "And whether it is what I want to do for the rest of my life, or whether it is what I have been doing because it was there and it needed doing and my father built it and it seemed like the right thing." She paused. "I think both of those are true." Daniel was quiet for a moment, listening in the way that was becoming one of the things she most valued about him. "And does one of those truths change what you want?" "No," she said, "but it clarifies it. I want to run the boarding house because I believe in it and because I'm good at it, not because it is the only thing available to me." She looked at him. "I wanted to say that to someone." "I'm glad you said it to me," he said. They stood at the fence looking at the creek, and he took her hand again in the easy way that had become natural between them. And she thought that this ordinary, sun-warmed, unpretentious moment was exactly what her father had meant. Not the decorative parts, as Daniel had said. The real thing underneath. He asked her to marry him in April. He did it at the boarding house in the parlor on a Wednesday evening after dinner when the boarders had retired, and Clara had been conspicuously present for dinner, and was now conspicuously absent from the parlor, a level of transparent engineering that Kate appreciated without acknowledging. He had not brought more flowers or any elaborate presentation. He sat across the parlor table from her, with his hat on the table between them, and he said, "I want to ask you to marry me, Kate. I have been thinking about how to do this in a way that is worthy of you, and I keep coming back to the fact that what you have always seemed to value is plainness and honesty, so I love you. I want to build a life with you. I want you to bring whatever you are and whatever you want to the rocking bee and make it better than it is, because you would, and because I don't want to do it without you. Will you marry me?" She had rehearsed no response. She had, in the preceding weeks, thought about this conversation more than she would have admitted to anyone, and she had considered and discarded several responses that were either too restrained or too much. What came out of her mouth was the truth, which was what she had always relied on. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Daniel. I love you too, and I want all of that." He came around the table and she stood, and he put his hands on her face the way you hold something you are very careful with. And he kissed her for the first time, and it was not tentative and it was not performative. It was simply honest and warm and entirely itself. And she kissed him back with the full knowledge that this was the kind of weather her father had been talking about, and she was exactly where she wanted to be standing. Clara, who had been waiting on the back porch with a degree of patience that cost her considerably, came in 5 minutes later ostensibly for a glass of water and immediately burst into tears, which she blamed on the spring air, and which neither Kate nor Daniel believed for a single moment. The wedding was set for June, which gave them 8 weeks to arrange things, a timeline that suited Kate's practical nature, and that the town of Millhaven received with the enthusiasm of a community that had been watching the situation develop since October and considered itself collectively invested. Mrs. Haverson contributed the wedding cake. Reverend Moss agreed to marry them without requiring what he called the usual period of consultation, on the grounds that he had watched them court since February and considered them already thoroughly consulted with one another. The Garfield sisters made Kate's wedding dress, a matter that was settled in one meeting of surprising efficiency, because Kate knew what she wanted and stated it clearly, and the Garfield sisters, who complained constantly about brides who could not make up their minds, were nearly undone by gratitude. There were complications. There were always complications. The first was the boarding house itself. The question of what happened to it when Kate moved to the Rocking Bee was not a simple one, and it was Clara who raised it first, at the kitchen table over coffee on a Saturday in May, with the careful directness of someone who had been thinking about it for a while. "You can't run the Rocking Bee and the boarding house from 8 miles apart," Clara said. "I know that," Kate said. "Are you going to sell it?" Kate wrapped her hands around her cup. The boarding house was in front of her in her mind the way it always was her father's work, his hands in every wall and floor and ceiling, his name over the door. "I don't want to sell it," she said. "Not yet. Not before I have to." "I could run it," Clara said, and then stopped, as though the words had come out before she'd fully decided to say them. Kate looked at her sister. Clara was 23, quick and warm and more capable than she gave herself credit for. She had been coming to the boarding house every weekend for a year. She knew the accounts, the tenants, the suppliers. She knew the house the way Kate knew it. "Could you?" Kate said. "I think I'd like to try," Clara said. I've been thinking about what I want to do, and I think this might be it, if you'd trust me with it." "Of course I would trust you with it," Kate said. "It's half yours anyway. Papa never said otherwise." Clara pressed her lips together in a way that meant she was trying not to cry, which Kate had long ago identified as the family trait neither of them had successfully outgrown. "I just want you to be sure," Clara said. "I am sure," Kate said. "Of Daniel, of the ranch, of you. I am more sure of all three of those things than I have been of anything since Papa." They sat in the kitchen for another hour talking through the practical details. The accounts, the mortgage payments, the supplier arrangements, the particular habits of each boarder. And by the end of it, they had the shape of a plan that satisfied them both. And Clara hugged Kate at the door when she left with the ferocity of someone who was not letting go because they were leaving, but because they were glad to have something worth holding. The second complication was the matter of Jed Marsh. Jed Marsh was 61, had been with the Rocking Bee since before Daniel was born, and had a complicated relationship with change that expressed itself primarily through silence. He had watched the courtship with the squinting assessment of a man who was not hostile but was not convinced, and in the weeks after the engagement was announced, his silences had a quality that Daniel described to Kate as a weather system moving in. Kate asked Daniel if she might speak with Jed herself. Daniel looked uncertain for a moment, and then said that if she thought it would help, and that it was her choice to make. She went to the Rocking Bee on a Tuesday, without Daniel, and found Jed in the barn repairing a piece of harness with the meticulous patience of a man who had been doing the same thing for 40 years. She sat on a tack box and said, "Mr. Marsh, I understand you have reservations about the change that's coming to this ranch, and I think you're entitled to say what they are." Jed Marsh looked at her over the harness for a long moment. "Mr. Bishop didn't send you," he said. "No," she said. "I came myself." Another long moment. "I've seen women come to ranches before," he said. "Mostly it goes one of two ways. Either the woman changes everything and the ranch isn't itself anymore, or the ranch wins and the woman isn't herself anymore. Neither one suits." "I agree with you," Kate said, "so I'll tell you what I intend. I intend to run the house as a house, and Daniel will run the ranch as a ranch, and I will consult him on ranch matters, and I expect he will consult me on domestic ones, and neither of us will be in the other's way without reason. I have no interest in changing what works. I have some interest in improving what doesn't, and I would find it very helpful to have someone with your knowledge of this land telling me what the difference is." Jed Marsh looked at her for another long moment. "You know how to ride," he said finally. "Well enough," she said. He nodded once with the conclusiveness of a verdict. He turned back to the harness. "That sorrel mare in the second stall is gentle," he said. "You could use her when you're out here. Good-natured animal. Just don't let her smell the feed bucket before you've got her bridled or she'll give you trouble." "Thank you, Mr. Marsh," Kate said. "Jed," he said without looking up, "if you're going to be here." She rode the sorrel mare back to town, slowly and happily, thinking that the world was full of people worth understanding if you were willing to ask. The third complication was harder. 2 weeks before the wedding, a man named Ellis Crane arrived in Millhaven. He was 45, broad through the chest, with the well-dressed authority of a man who had money and was comfortable using it as a social instrument. He announced at the land office, interested in purchasing land in the area, specifically the parcel that ran along the eastern edge of the Rocking Bee, which was currently owned by an elderly couple named the Winstons who had been thinking about selling and moving to live with their daughter in San Antonio. The parcel itself was not the complication. The complication was that Ellis Crane was also interested with a presumption and directness that struck everyone who heard about it as remarkable in Kate Keene. He had met her father once, years ago, in passing, and considered himself on that basis to have some standing. He called at the boarding house on the second day of his visit, was received by Clara, who told him Kate was occupied, and he left a calling card and a note that Clara described to Kate as extremely familiar in tone for a man who had no history here. Kate read the note and handed it back to Clara and said, "Burn it," and Clara said, "With pleasure," and that should have been the end of it. It was not quite the end of it, because Ellis Crane was the kind of man who heard no as a preliminary rather than a conclusion. He encountered Kate at the Mercantile 2 days later and attempted a conversation that she terminated in 4 sentences, and he appeared at the church social the following Saturday and spent an amount of time in Kate's vicinity that she found irritating and that Daniel, across the room, found something rather more than irritating. She saw it on his face. She had come to read his face well. The gray-green eyes went very still, and the jaw set in a way that was not rage, but was the visible surface of a much more controlled response, and she thought it was important to deal with this herself before it became something else. She crossed to Daniel and put her hand on his arm and said, in a very low voice, "I need you to trust me to handle this." He looked at her. "I do," he said, meaning it. "Then stay where you are," she said. She went back to where Crane was standing near the door, wearing the comfortable satisfaction of a man who considered himself a gravitational field, and she said, "Mr. Crane, I am going to be very plain with you because I think plainness is more useful than ceremony in this situation. I am engaged to be married to Daniel Bishop. I have no interest in any acquaintance with you beyond what courtesy requires, and courtesy does not require much. I would appreciate it if you understood that clearly." Crane looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating. "A woman as capable as you, Miss Keene, tied to a small rancher, a woman as capable as me," she said, "makes her own choices about her own life and does not require your assessment of them. Good evening." She walked back across the room to Daniel, and she was aware that several people had watched the exchange, including the Garfield sisters, and that by Monday morning the precise content of those 30 seconds would be the most accurate piece of social information to circulate in Millhaven in the past year. Daniel looked at her. "Done," she said. He took her hand. "I know you didn't need me to. I know you know that," she said. "That's one of the reasons I'm marrying you." Ellis Crane purchased the Winston parcel, which was his business, and he stayed in Millhaven for another 10 days completing the land transaction, and he did not approach Kate again, which demonstrated either wisdom or the capacity to correctly read a situation when it was made sufficiently clear. He departed on a westbound stage on the Thursday before the wedding, which Kate noted without particular feeling, and the parcel he had purchased sat quiet on the eastern edge of the rocking bee land, and did not, in the event, cause any further difficulty. The 15th of June, 1882, was a clear day with a west wind and the sky that particular shade of blue that appeared in Texas in early summer before the heat turned everything white and flat. Kate wore the dress the Garfield sisters had made cream-colored wool with small pearl buttons up the back that Clara spent 20 minutes fastening with a hook while describing, at great length, her feelings about Kate's happiness, which were extensive and occasionally incoherent. The church was full. Millhaven was not a large town, but it was a complete one, and everyone in it who could manage it was in that church for reasons that had as much to do with community as with ceremony. Hector Purvis was there, and Deputy Cruz, and the Garfield sisters, and Mrs. Haverson, and Reverend and Mrs. Moss, and the 3 permanent hands from the rocking bee, including old Jed Marsh, who wore a jacket that had not been worn in some years, and who stood in the second pew with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who was moved but was not going to admit it to anyone. Pete Voss stood with Daniel. Clara stood with Kate. Reverend Moss was blessedly brief. He said what was true and important and left out what was decorative, and Kate stood in the light coming through the church's single clear glass window and listened to Daniel's voice saying the words with the same quality of certainty he brought to everything, and she set hers back with the full weight of what she meant. And when he put the ring on her finger, a plain gold band, exactly right, she felt the solidity of it as something that was not a constraint but a foundation. He kissed her in front of everyone, and Millhaven made a sound of collective approval, and Clara, predictably, cried again, and Jed Marsh unfolded his arms. The wedding supper was at the boarding house, arranged by Clara with the help of Mrs. Haverson and Ella Voss, and it was the kind of long, generous, good-humored evening that people remember for years. The fiddle came out. The tables were pushed back. Kate danced with Daniel in the parlor of her father's house, while the June twilight came through the open windows, and the laughter of people they loved filled the rooms. And she thought of her father and how much he would have liked Daniel Bishop, the directness and the competence and the complete absence of pretension. And she felt him there in the way that people you have loved are present even after they're gone, in the walls they built, in the standards they taught, in the quality of person you know to choose. They drove out to the rocking bee late in the evening, just the 2 of them under a sky full of stars with the warm June wind moving through the grass, and the house was lit inside by the lamp Daniel had left burning, and it was quiet and entirely theirs. "Are you afraid?" he asked her at the door. "No," she said. "Are you?" "A little," he said honestly, "of not being enough." She took his face in her hands the way he had taken hers in the parlor in April, and she said, "You are enough. You have been enough since October in the church hall." He covered her hands with his. "The coffee cup," he said. "The coffee cup," she agreed. He smiled, the full version, the real one, the one she had waited to see since October and had now been seeing for months, and which still did the same thing to her chest every time. "Come inside," he said. She did. The summer settled into a life that was both busier and better than anything Kate had previously known. The rocking bee was, as she had told Daniel, a place where a person could make something real, and she made something real there with the same focused, practical energy she had brought to everything she had ever taken on. The house was clean and well organized within the first week. The kitchen garden, which had been a good concept inadequately executed in previous years, was replanted by Kate's hands in late June, and began producing by August with a reliability that delighted Jed Marsh, who had a particular feeling about tomatoes that he shared with no one, but which was evident from the way he checked the plants every morning on his way to the barn. Kate learned the land from Jed, in the slow, knowledge-rich way of someone listening to a person who knows more than they will ever fully communicate. She learned which sections of fence required the most attention, where the creek ran low in August, which of the horses had history and which were new. She learned the rhythm of the ranch's day from the inside, and Daniel watched her learn it with a quality of attention that was not evaluation but appreciation. Clara ran the boarding house with growing confidence. The seed merchant Cooper had moved on, replaced by a surveyor who was in Millhaven for 6 months mapping the county roads, and Miss Ella Voss had settled in with the permanence of someone who had found her place. The mortgage payments were met. The accounts were clean. Clara wrote to Kate every week, letters full of the boarding house news and the town news, and the particular kind of loving, teasing affection that had always characterized the correspondence between the Keene sisters. In September, Kate told Daniel she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen in the early morning, before the hands were up, sitting at the table with their coffee in the clear, cool air of a September dawn. She had known for 2 weeks and had spent those 2 weeks in a state of quiet, growing certainty that she had needed to hold privately for a moment before she shared it. He said nothing at first. He set down his cup and he looked at her across the table with an expression she had not seen on his face before, not the controlled steadiness of his ordinary face or the full version of the smile or the gray-green stillness when he was angry, but something else entirely, something open and unguarded and bright. Are you well?" he asked. "How are you feeling?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am happy, Daniel." He came around the table and put his arms around her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder, and they stayed like that in the early morning kitchen with the coffee going cold on the table, and the September light coming up outside, and everything completely and entirely right. Jed Marsh, who arrived at the kitchen door 10 minutes later for his customary morning cup of coffee, took one look at the two of them and turned back around and went to the barn, and they could hear him whistling all the way across the yard, which was something they had never heard him do before. The autumn moved with the particular speed of a season full of things happening. The fall roundup, which Kate participated in for the first time, not in the heavy work, but in the longer days of management and logistics, and feeding that many men at once required, gave her a thorough education in what Daniel's life was, and she found she loved it with the same direct, uncomplicated affection with which she had come to love the man himself. She was useful in a real way, and being useful in a real way was, for Kate Keene Bishop, one of the primary constituents of happiness. In October, exactly 1 year after the Millhaven Church Hall social, Kate and Daniel attended the autumn social together as husband and wife. They walked in together through the same door, under the same paper lanterns, into the same warm lamplight and familiar faces, and Kate looked at the refreshment table and at the coffee pot and laughed quietly to herself. "What?" Daniel said. "Nothing," she said. "A thought." He looked at the table and then at her, and then he understood, and the full smile appeared. "Seems like a long time ago," he said. "It does," she said, "and not long at all." He led her to the table. He picked up the pot. Without any ceremony whatsoever, with the same unhurried, uncalculated naturalness as the first time, he filled her cup first. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Old habit," he said. She stood on her toes and kissed his cheek, right there at the refreshment table at the Millhaven Autumn Social, in front of everyone, including the Garfield sisters and Deputy Cruz and Mrs. Haverson and Reverend Moss, and the room made a warm sound of amusement and recognition, and Daniel Bishop looked exactly as he should have looked, which was like a man who was happy and knew it. The baby arrived in late April of 1883, on a cool night with rain on the roof of the rocking bee that Kate found curiously comforting. Clara had come out a week before, and was settled in the spare room with the matter-of-fact competence of a woman who had decided she was going to be exactly where she was needed. Ella Voss, who had acquired some nursing experience before her teaching career, and who Clara had recruited with characteristic efficiency, was also there. It was a long night, but not a terrible one. Daniel sat outside the bedroom door for 4 hours, and Jed Marsh sat in the kitchen for 3 of those hours without saying a word, which Kate knew about later from Clara's description, and which she found more touching than she could adequately express. The baby was a boy. Daniel held him first, which Kate had specified in advance, because she had thought about it and decided that was right. She watched Daniel hold his son with the same gravity and care he brought to everything, the big careful hands that knew how to hold a newborn, and his face did the thing again, the open, unguarded brightness, and she thought she would probably never stop finding that face entirely undoing. "William," she said. Daniel looked at her. They had discussed names tentatively over the preceding months, and William had been on her list, but she had not pressed it. "William Daniel Bishop," she said. "If you think that's right." He looked down at the baby and then at her, and his voice when he answered was not entirely steady. "I think that's right," he said. "I think that's exactly right." Clara, from the corner of the room, let out a single, thoroughly undisguised sob, and then immediately composed herself and said that she needed to check the water on the stove, and left the room, and they could hear her weeping quietly in the hallway for about 30 seconds before she blew her nose with decisive energy and came back in. Jed Marsh, informed of the baby's arrival and the name, said good, and went back to the barn, and then reappeared 20 minutes later with a small carved wooden horse that no one had known he was making, which he placed on the table by the door and which would, in the years to come, be William's most treasured possession. The world continued. Millhaven grew slowly, the way small Texas towns grew in the early 1880s. A new telegraph office, a second saloon that did somewhat less business than the first, a doctor, finally, a young man named Dr. Harrison who arrived from Missouri and who could not have been happier to find Kate Bishop, who he recognized immediately as the kind of organized, observant person who would know which families needed watching and could be relied on to keep accurate information. The rocking bee expanded. In the spring of 1884, Daniel acquired an additional 40 acres of pasture along the creek, and the cattle count passed 500. He took on a sixth hand, a quiet man named Samuel Reed, who had been a Buffalo soldier, and who brought to the rocking bee a quality of experience and discipline that everyone respected, though the town of Millhaven, in the complicated way of small Western communities in that era, required time to fully extend him the regard he deserved. Daniel was direct about where he stood on the question. He paid Samuel Reed the same wage as his other hands, introduced him the same way, and made clear to anyone who suggested otherwise that the rocking bees business was not conducted on the basis of anything other than a man's character and his work. It was the kind of thing that caused some quiet friction in certain corners of town, and rather a lot of quiet respect in others. Kate, for her part, made sure Mrs. Reed Samuel had a wife, a small, quiet woman named Hannah who had come from Kansas, had what she needed in Millhaven without condescension and without ceremony. She invited Hannah to the church social. She introduced her to Mrs. Haverson and to Clara. She was aware that she could not solve the larger architecture of injustice with an invitation to a social, but she could choose, every day, to see clearly and act accordingly, and that was what she did. Clara, meanwhile, had become something unexpected. It was Pete Voss. Kate saw it before Clara admitted it, in the same way she suspected her father would have seen things about her had he lived to see the autumn social and the coffee cup. Clara's weekly letters began mentioning Pete with an increasing frequency that had a particular quality, not gossip, not the general reporting of neighborhood news, but the specific, involuntary attention of someone whose awareness has been claimed by a person. When Kate mentioned it, in December of 1883, Clara wrote back a letter that began with 3 paragraphs of vigorous denial and ended with half a page of something rather different. Pete Voss, for his own part, had been coming to the boarding house for Sunday dinner with a regularity that now had no official connection to Daniel's visits, since Daniel and Kate were at the rocking bee and no longer present at the table. He was helping with the wood chopping on weekends. He had fixed the back gate without being asked. Daniel, told of this development by Kate on a Sunday evening in the rocking bee kitchen, looked unsurprised. "Pete's been different since last spring," he said. "Better focused, Does his work well and thinks ahead. I thought it was maturity." He paused. "I suppose it might be both." Kate wrote to Clara and said, in terms that were direct and warm and entirely themselves, that Pete Voss was a good man, that she trusted Daniel's judgment about the people around him, and that happiness, when it presented itself, was worth reaching for. Clara wrote back, "I know, I know, I know." Pete Voss asked Clara Keene to marry him in March of 1884, in the parlor of the boarding house, which Clara described to Kate in a letter of approximately 2,000 words that Kate read at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning, and that made her laugh and cry in an intermixed way that confused baby William, who was almost a year old and watching her from his blanket on the floor with the wide-eyed philosophical interest of a person for whom most of life is still unexplained. "Your aunt is getting married," Kate told him. William regarded her with equanimity. "You'll like her husband," Kate said. "He has a good horse." William reached for the letter with the concentrated intention of someone who has decided that any object receiving this much adult attention is worth investigating. And Kate lifted it out of his reach and kissed the top of his head and went right back to Clara with everything she felt, which was considerable. The double wedding, because it was Clara who suggested it, with the bright, practical logic that had always been her signature, was held in June of 1884, almost exactly 2 years after Kate and Daniel's. Reverend Moss presided again, with the benevolent expression of a man who finds his profession continually providing evidence for his best opinions about humanity. The church was full again. Jed Marsh wore the same jacket. Mrs. Haverson made 2 cakes. Kate stood beside Clara at the altar of the Millhaven church, holding William on her hip because he was at the age where being put down was a philosophical position he found unacceptable, and she looked at the 4 of them in the June light, Clara and Pete and Daniel and herself, and she thought that the world had done something right. Daniel caught her eye across the altar and did the thing with the corners of his mouth that was the precursor to the real smile, and she met it with one of her own, and William, between them, reached for his father's hand with the imperious certainty of a very small person who knew exactly what he wanted and where everything was, and Daniel took his son's hand and held both of them, Kate and William, in the clear June morning. And the feeling in Kate's chest was so complete and so quiet and so large that she could not have named it, except that it was the thing her father had told her about, the thing with real weather in it, and she was standing in it fully, without shelter and without the desire for any. By the autumn of 1884, the Rocking Bee was the most well-run ranch of its size in the county, and Daniel was beginning to have the kind of conversations with other ranchers about water rights and land use, and the future of the Texas cattle market that marked a man as someone whose opinion mattered. He did not seek this standing. He had it because he was competent and fair and honest, which in Millhaven, Texas, in 1884 still meant something. Kate managed the household with the same focused capability she had always applied to everything she ran, and she also began, quietly, to take on a larger role in the community's practical life. She organized the first regular lending of books in Millhaven, using the boarding house's small library as a starting point, and she worked with Ella Voss, now Ella Garner, having married the county clerk in a modest ceremony in August, to establish a regular school supply fund, because the school had been operating on a budget so thin it was a wonder it had survived the decade. These were not grand gestures. They were the kind of steady, practical, unflashy contributions that kept small communities from coming apart at the seams, and Kate made them the way she made everything, with competence and without requiring applause. She was not without struggle. The second pregnancy, in late 1884, was harder than the first, more nausea, more fatigue, and a harder stretch of winter that year that kept everyone indoors and close, and tested the patience of even the most agreeable household. There were days when the land was ice and gray, and the baby was fussy, and the stove smoked badly, and Daniel came in late from a fence problem, and dinner was cold, and everything was simultaneously more difficult than it should have been. And she sat in the kitchen some nights with her hands in her lap and acknowledged that she was tired, and that being tired was not the same as being beaten. And then she got up and did what needed doing. Daniel on those nights made the coffee. He always made it without asking, and he always brought it to her first, and she always accepted it the way you accept a thing that is given completely. The cup and everything behind it, the steady, long commitment love of a man who did not say more than he meant but always meant what he said, who showed you in the same unhurried and uncalculated way every day that you were first, before his own needs, not out of submission, but out of the kind of love that keeps choosing its object over and over. She never stopped noticing. She had told him once in the winter of that year, lying in the dark with the wind against the house and William asleep in the next room, that she still thought about the coffee cup. The first time at the social, the way it had happened and what it had told her. It was a cup of coffee, he said. It was the most accurate thing anyone has ever done, she said, without meaning it as a demonstration. That's what made it true. He was quiet and she could feel him thinking, and then he said, "I saw you come in. I saw the way you were standing, just inside the door, looking at everyone. You looked like someone who was doing the right thing and wishing you were somewhere else." "I was," she said. "I thought," he paused. "I thought that whoever you were, you deserved a cup of coffee before any of the rest of it." She turned to look at him in the dark. "That's all it was." "That was all of it," he said. She took his hand under the blankets. "I came to the boarding house after," she said, "that night. And I lay in the dark and I thought about it, and I thought, whoever that man is, that is the kind of man I want. I did not even know your name." "And now you do," he said. "And now I do," she said. The second child was born in July of 1885, in a summer that was hot and long and smelled of dry grass and creek water. It was a girl, and she was loud and opinionated from the first hour, which Daniel observed with the expression of a man who found this entirely predictable and not in the least bit troubling. "Margaret," Kate said, "for your mother." Daniel's mother had died when he was 19, and he had not spoken of her often, but he had spoken of her with the particular, restrained love of someone for whom the loss was still sharp. He looked at his daughter, who was red-faced and insistent and absolutely herself, and then at his wife, and his face did what it always did. "Margaret," he said. "Yes." William, who was 2 years old and had spent the entire morning being managed by Clara and Pete in the front yard, with very strong opinions about everything, was introduced to his sister that afternoon and regarded her with an expression of concentrated uncertainty that gradually resolved, over the following days, into a proprietary devotion that would characterize their relationship for the rest of their childhoods. Jed Marsh produced another carved wooden figure. This time it was a horse with a foal. Clara, who was by now very competently established at the boarding house with Pete, came out to the rocking bee and held Margaret for an hour and told her, at some length, about the importance of always knowing her own mind, while William sat at Clara's feet and listened to this advice as though it were also for him, which Clara said it was. Life at the rocking bee moved into the settled, full, forward-moving rhythm of a home that was real, not perfect, because no home with real people in it was ever perfect, and Kate had never wanted perfect, which she considered a kind of sterility, but honest and warm and built on something true. The land was good. The cattle were doing well. Daniel had a reputation now that reached beyond Millhaven, and he navigated the expanded responsibilities of that reputation with the same undemonstrative steadiness he brought to everything. Kate had her books and her garden and her community work and her 2 children and her husband and the particular, enormous, ordinary satisfaction of a life that was entirely hers. She rode the sorrel mare on Saturdays when the weather permitted, across the creek fence line and out over the east pasture, and she felt the land under the horse's feet and the sky above her and the wind on her face, and she thought of her father saying that the world was worth building in, that Millhaven was worth something, and she thought, yes, it is. It very much is. In the autumn of 1885, exactly 3 years after the Millhaven Church Hall social, Kate and Daniel stood at the rocking bee fence on an October evening and watched the sun go down over the west pasture. It was the same kind of evening as the one in January when she had first come to see the ranch, the air crisp and clean, the sky going copper and rose, the creek line a dark thread through the gold grass. William was inside with Clara, who had brought him out for the day. Margaret was asleep in the house. Having tired herself out completely with the vigorous displeasure she expressed about every nap and surrendered to only at the last possible moment. Daniel had brought 2 cups of coffee out to the fence, as he sometimes did in the evenings, and he handed Kate hers before taking his own, and she took it and stood beside him at the fence and looked at the light on the land. "I keep thinking about October," she said. 3 years, he said. 3 years, she agreed. The light moved over the grass in the way it did at that hour, long and golden and clear, and the horses in the far pasture were still against the sky. She stood with her coffee and her husband and the good solid weight of everything they had made together in 3 years, and she thought it was remarkable, the distance between that evening in the church hall, the doorway, the loneliness, the borrowed dress and the paper lanterns and the grief of July still in her chest, and this evening, this fence, this man, this cup of coffee. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking," she said, "that it was a very long way from there to here." He looked at the land. "Worth it?" She turned to look at him. He was looking at the west pasture with the familiar, settled gravity of his face, the gray-green eyes and the jaw and the dark hair going silver at the temples now, and she thought he was the most honest face she had ever looked at, and that she had loved it every day for 3 years without the love diminishing into habit, but instead deepening in the way that only real things deepened. Everything worth having, she said, was a long way from somewhere. He looked at her then, and the full smile, the real one, the unhurried, genuine, entirely itself smile appeared, and he put his arm around her at the fence and she leaned against his shoulder, and they stood there in the October evening with the sky going deep, and the coffee warm in their hands and the sound of the land around them. Not long after, from inside the house, they heard William's voice and Clara's laughter, and faintly, the sound of Margaret deciding that her nap was over and announcing this fact with considerable volume and conviction. "She's going to be exactly like you," Daniel said. "God help us all," Kate said. He laughed a full laugh, warm and real, and she laughed with him, and they turned from the fence and walked back toward the lighted house, and the door opened, and the children and the warmth came out to meet them. Inside, Clara had laid the table. Pete was coming for dinner. Jed Marsh, who had taken to appearing at the evening table on Sundays with the same regular inevitability as weather, was already at his chair. William had arranged his wooden horse and foal beside his plate. Margaret, carried in by Clara, was regarding the room with the comprehensive critical assessment of a 4-month-old, who was not yet sure the world had fully met her standards. Daniel set his coffee cup on the table and reached for his daughter, who transferred her assessment to his face with the same intensity. And then, because she was her father's daughter and her mother's daughter both, she relented, and settled, and was entirely content. Kate stood in the doorway of her father's kitchen, which was now her kitchen, and looked at the table that was full and the lamplight on the faces she loved and the good, plain, honest life that was built here, on this land in this house, from one October evening and a cup of coffee and a man who had done, without thinking, the thing that told the truth about who he was. She had not forgotten it. She would not forget it for the rest of her life, which was long and full and good, and ended many years later in the same house, in the same land with the same man beside her, both of them old and well-weathered and entirely satisfied with everything they had chosen, right up to the last October evening they sat together at the south porch of the Rocking Bee and watched the sun go down over the west pasture and held their coffee cups in the cool air, his warmth beside hers, hers beside his. The land theirs and the life theirs and the love between them exactly what her father had promised it would be. Real weather, all of it, every storm, every clear day, worth every mile of the long way home.